So let's go into these Four Noble Truths together and really break them down one by one to get a clear understanding of them. The Four Noble Truths, while they are foundational to all Buddhist teachings, they are also often misinterpreted and misunderstood, and these truths offer great insight, but the subtlest difference in understanding can really create an entirely different experience in oneself, some that are rather negative. For example, the first noble truth is the truth of suffering. This one is pretty universally agreed upon. So, it is simply the fact that suffering exists. However, even this teaching is often misinterpreted to some people to mean that everything is suffering, as if the Buddha taught that suffering is the only thing that exists in life, which really is pretty obviously not the case. Joy, happiness, peace, these are experiences that we have, so clearly life is not all suffering, though this is unfortunately a common misinterpretation of this first noble truth. The first noble truth is not that there is only suffering, it's simply to acknowledge suffering. And this is actually something that's quite revolutionary, because most of us spend a lot of our time trying to escape our suffering, rather than recognizing that within us there is an experience of suffering or discontent, dissatisfaction, anguish. Really, this term suffering is a translation of the Pali word dukkha, and dukkha refers to all forms of suffering, not just what we may associate the word suffering with as being some extreme form of pain or agony. It encompasses all forms of unhappiness or discontent, from mild dissatisfaction and unhappiness or unease, all the way to agony, despair, extreme pain and suffering in the mind. It is mostly referring to psychological suffering as well. And there is a distinction between pain and suffering. So, pain is a physical response. It's something that our bodies and our nervous system signals when we experience harm, when it's a natural reaction, and there's really nothing we can do to avoid experiencing pain in life. It is just a natural phenomenon. However, we can learn how to become free from psychological suffering. And so there is this distinction between pain and suffering. We can experience physical pain without adding on stories about it, without relating to it in a very fearful or negative way that creates this whole other layer of psychological suffering around that physical pain. And so when the Buddha talked about being free of suffering, it is being free of this psychological suffering in the mind, the suffering of anxiety, the suffering that is caused by fear, by depression, by stress, by anger, by feelings of aloneness and isolation, all of these mental and emotional pains that we experience. It's possible to transform these feelings in such a way that we experience life with peace, with joy, with happiness, with liberation, and really experiencing life with freedom, with liberation and awakening. And so this first noble truth is the truth that suffering exists. It's rather than looking for things outside of us to find an answer to help us escape from our suffering, whether that is something, usually some form of consumption, like consuming, eating food, taking some kind of drug, looking for it in relationships, looking for it in our phones and in distraction and entertainment, rather than seeking for things outside of ourselves to help us escape our suffering, we turn our attention inwards towards ourselves and simply just acknowledge this fact that suffering exists. And really, this can be a life-changing recognition and acknowledgement in oneself to simply say, like, I'm suffering. I experience suffering. I'm experiencing dissatisfaction in my life. I'm experiencing anxiety. I'm experiencing loneliness. Whatever it is, to first acknowledge that this suffering exists. That is the first noble truth. It's the acknowledgement that suffering is a universal experience. It's something that we all experience, and so to acknowledge suffering in oneself also helps one to acknowledge that every being experiences suffering. I experience suffering. I experience anxiety. I experience the emotions of sadness, of anger, of depression, or whatever emotional waves I'm experiencing in my life that are uncomfortable, that are painful, that are hurtful or challenging. And in the same way you experience suffering, you experience the same types of suffering that I do, although in a very unique way according to your unique circumstances. And so to recognize that suffering is a universal experience, it's something we all experience. That is the point of the first noble truth. The second noble truth is the recognition that there is a cause to suffering. Suffering isn't something that is, just happens out of the blue. Suffering has causes that contribute to it. And traditionally in Buddhist sutras, the cause of suffering is referred to as trishna, which translates to as desire or craving. And I want to be very clear and careful with how I communicate this, because this is probably the truth or the aspect of the Four Noble Truths that is most often misinterpreted and misunderstood. And so, for one, desire is not inherently bad. There are good desires and there are bad desires, or perhaps good and bad aren't the right terms. There are desires that lead to greater happiness and peace within ourselves, and there are desires that cause us more stress, anxiety, anguish, and perpetuate our suffering. And so a more accurate word than desire is craving. It's not just desiring or wanting something, it's this feeling of craving, like I need to have this thing, and if I don't have this thing, then I can't be happy, then I can't be at peace. And this is something most of us subconsciously experience. We have this sense within us that once I get this thing, whatever it is, whether it's some relationship or some job or some house or car or whatever our mind is focused on, we have this sense that once I obtain that thing, then I'll be happy. And this can be a whole range from just mild discontent to full on just unsatisfied craving and longing for whatever we think it is that we need. And this word trishna or craving has often also been translated as the fever of unsatisfied longing. And I think that's a really powerful statement. The fever of unsatisfied longing. So it's this feeling of anguish within us that is longing for something outside of ourselves. And this is often referred to as the cause of suffering. However, during the time of the Buddha, for the first 450 years, before any of his words were written down, they were translated orally. And so, or transmitted orally, rather. And so, in order to understand these teachings, there were many lists. There were many different teachings that are like the five or the four foundations of mindfulness, the five skandhas, koshas or sheaths in the body, the three seals of reality. There's all these lists that are created in Buddhism, and there is one relevant here is the kleshas. And kleshas is a Sanskrit word which refer to the things within us, the thoughts, emotions, the qualities that cause us suffering. They've often been referred to as the stains of the mind, the disturbances of the mind. They are these different things within us that lead to our suffering and unhappiness. And just like many of the Buddhist teachings from different traditions, some lists of the kleshas are the five kleshas, some are the seven kleshas, or nine kleshas. And at the very top of this list of things that cause suffering, there is trishna, desire or craving. And so often when the Buddha or Buddhist teachings say that craving is the root of suffering, they're really referring to the whole list of the kleshas, not just craving. But that context is often not understood, and so people often take this term craving and try to see that as the only cause to our suffering. But of course, craving is not the only cause to our suffering. We experience suffering because of anger, because of jealousy, because of fear, because of other emotions within us that can contribute to our unhappiness. And so, really, a better way of understanding this second noble truth, the cause of suffering, is really just to look into yourself, look into your suffering, and to really try to understand what is bringing this suffering about. And there are yet another list in Buddhism. There are the Four Nutraments, which is a teaching that looks at the four different things that tend to cause our suffering or our unhappiness. And so the first is physical food. The food that we consume can contribute to our illness and our suffering, or it can contribute to our wellness and our happiness. Food really does have a very powerful effect on us. It's our primary source of nourishment. It's where we get the nutrients that our body needs in order to regenerate our cells, in order to keep our body moving with the energy that we need. And so if you're not getting the right nutrients, or you're taking in toxins in your food, it's going to produce a feeling of illness, a feeling of suffering. And so it's very important to take in foods that are wholesome, that are nutritious, and that are free of toxins to the best that we can control, so that we have an experience of health, an experience of well-being, an experience of joy and happiness in our bodies. So this first nutriment is physical food. The second nutriment is sense impressions. It's the things that we take in and consume through our senses. And so our five senses are always taking in information from the outside world, and this information is having an effect on our minds and our experience of life, and whether we're experiencing with suffering and dissatisfaction, or whether we're experiencing with wellness and happiness and joy. So the movies that you watch, the TV shows that you watch, the books that you read, the music that you listen to, the environments that you're in, these all have an effect on your consciousness. And if you're consuming sensory impressions that are negative, that promote anger or violence or craving in yourself, it's going to produce these qualities in your mind, and it's going to contribute to your unhappiness and to your suffering. On the other hand, when you consume positive sensory impressions, when you listen to music that has a positive message, that is inspiring of joy, when you watch media that contributes to your mindfulness, to your knowledge, to your understanding, to your peace, when you read books, when you're in environments, in social settings that all contribute to joy and well-being, it's going to produce those qualities within yourself. And so this is the second nutriment to consider, is what are the sensory impressions that you're consuming, and are they leading to happiness, or are they leading to unhappiness? The third nutriment is volition, which is very interesting. To me, I find very interesting that this is one of the nutriments that we consume. It's our volition. What is our attitude? What is our desire towards something? And so, or our motivation towards something. So some of us are motivated, have a volition towards having a positive impact in the world, towards finding happiness within ourselves, towards experiencing health. Others, or some of us may have volitions towards just material accumulation of things. We're doing the things we're doing so that we can get clothes or money, or we're doing the things that we're doing so we can get fame and recognition and validation, or doing the things we're doing so we can have security. We're afraid of being insecure or unsafe. So to really check in with oneself and check in with your motivation and see, why is it that I'm doing what I'm doing? This volition, this motivation, is considered as a food, as a nutriment in Buddhism, and it's, again, one that can either lead to our wellness or our illness. And the fourth and final nutriment is consciousness. And this refers to the consciousness of the people that you surround yourself with. Consciousness is powerful. Our minds, our mental energy is incredibly powerful. And so the consciousnesses that you surround yourself with have an impact on your own consciousness. If you're spending a lot of your time and energy around people that have a very fearful, negative consciousness, that is like a poison for your mind. It's going to make your mind, your consciousness, start to take on some of those qualities. And so it's very important that you consider the other consciousnesses that you are around. And when you surround yourself with consciousnesses of peace, of well-being, of joy, of compassion, of positive qualities that you want to cultivate, that's going to have a very positive impact on your consciousness, and it's going to contribute to your happiness, your wellness, your well-being. So these four nutriments are really one of the main ways of looking at what contributes to our wellness and what contributes to what contributes to our illness. So far we've covered the first noble truths, our first two. The first one being that suffering exists. The second being that there is a cause to suffering. So the third noble truth is that there's a possibility of being free of our suffering. There's a possibility of experiencing true well-being and peace in ourselves. And this is done by removing the causes to suffering. It really is all pretty logical if you think about it. We experience suffering. There's a cause to our suffering. It's possible to be free of suffering, to experience well-being, and we can do that by removing the things that cause us suffering. So looking back at these four nutriments, let's say that I'm consuming food that is contributing to my illness, that is making me feel dull and sluggish. I'm taking in sense impressions like watching movies, scrolling on social media all the time, in negative environments. Then those are all going to, or I guess to add the other two and say, negative motivations. I'm doing things for recognition and validation and material things only, doing things only for pleasure. I'm hanging around consciousnesses that have a very negative, limiting perspective. That's going to all contribute to this very negative feeling of unhappiness and suffering within myself. However, if I am consuming food that is nutritious, that is organic, that is whole, natural food, that is giving my body the nutrients that it needs. It's not congesting it with toxins. It's allowing me to have the energy and the health that allows me to thrive. And consuming media that is like watering this positive seeds in my mind, feeding my joy, my peace, my well-being, my inspiration. I'm having a volition that is healthy and wholesome. I'm doing things that I'm doing for pure motives, pure reasons, for greater peace in myself, for greater peace to the people that I am around and care about, to compassion for the world, for having a positive social impact. If I'm surrounding myself with consciousnesses that really value well-being and peace and happiness, all of these qualities are going to create a much more positive, joyful experience within myself. And so the fourth noble truth in Buddhism is the Eightfold Path. And this is really the nectar of Buddhism. It's the path that the Buddha prescribed for helping one to overcome suffering or transform their suffering into peace, joy, and liberation. And so these Four Noble Truths are laid out kind of like a medical diagnosis. So in medicine, there is an illness. So the first step is identifying the illness. The second step is identifying the cause of the illness. How did this illness come about? What is the contributing factors to this illness? The third is whether there's a possibility of being free of this illness or not. And the fourth is the medical protocol, the prescription that one takes to become free of their illness. And in the same way, these Four Noble Truths are like a medical process evaluation for the illness within our minds, which is the suffering of anxiety, stress, fear, anger, resentment, grief, and so on. So to really acknowledge, first identify there is suffering. It exists within us. That secondly, there are causes to our suffering. There are things that contribute to us experiencing suffering. The third being that there's a possibility of being free of this suffering and a genuine possibility of experiencing real well-being in our lives. We can live with true freedom and happiness and joy. And this fourth one, the Eightfold Path, is the way that the medical prescription or protocol for us to experience true joy, freedom, and happiness, and freedom from our suffering. And I want to also make a note of something. This terminology of being free of suffering may not actually be the correct wording. I really like the way that Thich Nhat Hanh explains it, in that it's transforming our suffering, because suffering in itself isn't a bad thing. We actually gain a lot of positive benefits from our suffering. And while many of us want to experience a life that has no suffering whatsoever, it is through suffering that we really learn and grow. And when we're experiencing suffering, we tend to look deeply more into ourselves, to really ask these deeper questions, like what is going on? Why are things the way that they are? What is happening here in this life, in this existence? Who am I? What do I really want? How do I get the things that I want? There's all these deeper reflections and contemplations and understandings come from a lot of our suffering. If we're always experiencing happiness and joy, we may not really ask these deeper questions. And so, while a big part of the Buddhist teaching and philosophy is to become free, to have freedom from suffering in some way, it's also really the freedom of not being overwhelmed by suffering, and knowing this art of transforming our suffering, so that when we experience suffering, we don't get overwhelmed, we don't lose ourselves in the suffering, we don't become in excessive suffering and agony and despair and helplessness and really suffering to that extent. We can acknowledge our suffering, look deeply into seeing what the causes of it are, understand deeply what's contributing to our suffering, and through that gain insight into what we can do to cultivate well-being and how we can live in such a way that we experience life with greater well-being. So really it's a way of transmuting suffering into joy, freedom, and peace, and that's what these Four Noble Truths help us do. And this fourth truth of the Noble Eightfold Path, is really the way in which we do this, the way that we gain peace and freedom in ourselves. And these 8 branches of this path are right view is the first one. So having the right perspective on things, and in this Buddhist context, it's really to understand these Four Noble Truths. So having the right or correct view, the term right here is referring to correct. So the right view, having the right thinking, the right way of thinking in our minds, the right speech, the right way, a correct way of speaking and expressing ourselves, right action, the ways that we act in the world, having a correct way, a way that leads to well-being, right livelihood, so the things we do for a living, the way that we are making our way in the world, for that to be in harmony with our values of well-being, of peace, of joy, of compassion for others. Right effort, right effort or right diligence, which is referring to the motivation that we have towards things, why we do the things that we do, really having a correct volition or motivation. Right concentration, which is what are we focused on? Are we focused on the correct things, the right things? And right mindfulness, which is having the right presence, the right way of maintaining awareness in our lives. And these 8 factors together of right view, right thinking, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort or diligence, right concentration, right mindfulness, all of these contribute to an experience within ourselves of total peace and well-being in life. And the fact that there is a right or correct path also implies that there is a wrong or incorrect path. And so there is wrong view. There's ways of viewing reality that lead to our suffering and unhappiness. There is wrong thinking. There are ways of thinking that contribute to our suffering. There's wrong speech, ways of speaking that cause harm and conflict and chaos and disorder in our lives. There's wrong action, actions that cause harm to others and to ourselves. There's wrong livelihoods, livelihoods that cause pain and suffering in the world to others or to the environment. There is wrong effort, motivations towards things that are, having impure motives. There is wrong concentration, having poor focus and concentration in life. And there's also wrong mindfulness, or which is really no mindfulness, forgetfulness in our lives. And so all of these teachings, all of this Four Noble Truths, this Eightfold Path, is really just a way of saying that there is a way, there's suffering in life, there's the possibility of living a life full of suffering and unhappiness, and there's also a possibility of living life with well-being and happiness and freedom. There is a path that leads to us experiencing negativity and suffering and unhappiness, and there's a path that helps us to experience peace and joy and freedom. And really, the path that we walk comes down to our awareness and the choices that we make moment to moment each day, and whether we're choosing acting, thinking, speaking, living in ways that contribute to suffering or ways that contribute to happiness and joy. And foundational to all of these, the Eightfold Path, whether it's the correct one or the incorrect one, which one we choose, how we live our lives, whether we're experiencing suffering or experiencing well-being, foundational to all of this is whether we're experiencing life with mindfulness, presence, and awareness, or whether we're experiencing life with forgetfulness, inattention, and distraction, being a victim of our circumstances and programming, conditioning, or the influences around us, having no real awareness of ourselves. And so mindfulness was and is the core practice and teaching of Buddhism. It's why the Buddha was called the Awakened One, because he was awake, he was mindful, and he was so committed to this realization and this path of mindfulness that he no longer lost himself in forgetfulness. He trained his mind to the point where he really rested in mindfulness. He experienced life with total awareness. He no longer became forgetful. He no longer got caught up in his mind and his stories and narratives that caused him pain and suffering. He was free. He was free from the suffering of the mind and experiencing the peace and joy of living life with presence, awareness, and connection to the truth of what is. And the Buddha is often put on this pedestal. He's often looked to as a god, but the Buddha was a human being. And everything that he realized, everything that he woke up to and accomplished in himself are things that we have the potential to awaken to as well. We all have a Buddha nature within us. We have this latent potential of enlightenment or of awakening, of living a life with this presence, of being free from the suffering and forgetfulness and all of the confusion and dissatisfaction that comes from being caught and lost in our thinking. We have this capacity to wake up. We have the capacity to live a life of freedom, peace, and well-being, and to no longer be suffering, to know how to transform whatever suffering we may experience into joy instead of getting carried away and letting it totally overwhelm us and consume us. And so the way to do this is through cultivating mindfulness and through watering the positive seeds within ourselves, the seeds of joy and happiness and peace and freedom. And so in the next lesson, we're going to go a little bit deeper into this concept of watering seeds. I feel this video has already gotten a bit long, so I really thank you for watching this, and I hope that you're able to receive what is communicated here, because it's very important, it's very valuable, and I really encourage you to reflect on these Four Noble Truths yourself, and to really see within yourself whether you're living with right mindfulness, whether you're following this path that leads to well-being, or whether you're acting and following a path that leads to suffering. And to observe this without judgment, that's a core component with mindfulness, is just to observe and just see without judgment. And that really helps us gain greater insight and understanding when we just witness things as they are and see the impact that they're having. So in the next video, we'll go a little bit into this understanding of watering seeds. It's a very helpful Buddhist view of our psychology and understanding ourselves. And in tomorrow's lesson, we'll start to go into the 4 foundations of mindfulness. These are the ways that we establish ourselves in mindfulness. These are the ways that we ourselves become Buddhas, the way that we become awakened beings. And they are the foundational practices that the Buddha encouraged himself for all people to practice if they wish to awaken and experience true freedom and liberation within themselves.